Let the world outside soften for a moment. Let the clutter of the present day recede into a gentle hum, and allow your mind to drift toward a different kind of silence. Not an empty silence, but a deep and waiting one. The silence of a vault. The silence of a page unread for 1,000 years. The silence that gathers around a secret that has chosen not to speak. Today, we are not stepping into a story of what we know, but into the profound and haunting story of what we've been told is missing. This journey begins not with discovery, but with an absence, a palpable emptiness on a historical shelf. Where a book should be, the question is not shouted in debate halls. It is whispered in the quiet corners of scholarship and faith. What are some of the earliest voices, the most fragile understandings of the divine, were not lost to the natural erosion of time, but were gently, deliberately led into a room, and the door was closed behind them? This is the whisper we follow. A whisper about scriptures that may not have been destroyed, but were instead placed into a permanent twilight within the most secure library on earth. We begin by listening to that whisper and wondering what it is trying so patiently to say. To understand this whisper, you must first feel the weight of the word forbidden. It does not always mean evil. It does not always mean false. Often it simply means unsafe, an idea that arrives at the wrong moment, a teaching that disrupts a necessary unity, a narrative that offers a truth too complex for a world seeking simple answers. Throughout history, the guardians of tradition have often faced an impossible choice. Preserve every fragile strand of thought and risk unraveling the entire tapestry, or secure the weave by trimming away the threads that pull against the pattern. This is a subtle, unsettling territory we explore. The Vatican Secret Archive, or more accurately, the Vatican Apostolic Archive, is not a villain's lair. It is the ultimate expression of this custodial dilemma. Imagine an institution that is 2,000 years old. Imagine the sheer volume of its memory. Letters, decrees, trials, confessions, petitions, and testimonies. And among this ocean of ink, there are also scriptures, writings that fell outside the final sanctioned collection we call the Bible. Some were popular for a time, then faded. Some were debated, then rejected. And some may have been set aside, not because they were wrong, but because they were inconvenient. Their voice was a note of dissonance in a hymn that needed to sound as one. So the question transforms. We are no longer hunting for a mythical, explosive text that could shatter faith. We are contemplating a quieter, more human possibility, that some writings were judged not heretical, but hazardous, too spiritually independent for an age that required structure, too mystically intimate for an institution building universal authority. And if such writings existed, where would they go? They would not be paraded. They would not be celebrated. They would be archived, given a number, placed on a shelf, and remembered only by a select few whose job was not to revive them, but to remember where they were buried. This is the genesis of the forbidden scripture, not a book of dark magic, but a book of alternative light, a light that, for reasons of governance or stability or fear, was deemed best kept in a drawer. And so we begin at the beginning, with the birth of an archive and the birth of a secret. One could not exist without the other. The very act of preservation creates the possibility of concealment. To save everything is to decide what eventually might need to be forgotten. This is a delicate, shadowed path we walk. A path lined not with conspiracy, but with consequence. The consequence of an unbroken memory stretching back to antiquity, and all the difficult choices such a memory must hold. The name itself is a kind of doorway. Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, the secret archive of the Vatican. In our modern ears, the word secret sparks immediate intrigue. It suggests hidden knowledge, classified files, truths kept from the public. But language evolves, and history carries older meanings. Here, secretum does not primarily mean clandestine or concealed. It comes from a Latin root meaning set apart or private. This was the Pope's personal archive, his private library, a collection separate from the main Vatican library, containing the working documents of the papacy and the central administration of the Church. This distinction is vital. It was not founded as a museum of heresy or a dungeon for dangerous ideas. It began as a practical, administrative necessity. A sovereign entity, both spiritual and temporal, must keep its records. Treaties, correspondence with kings and emperors, financial ledgers, judicial proceedings, petitions from bishops across the globe. This was the memory of a living, governing body. For centuries, these documents were housed somewhat haphazardly, in chests, in palace rooms, in the towers of the Vatican. They were moved, they suffered from damp and fire and neglect. It was only in the early 17th century, under Pope Paul V, that a conscious, systematic effort was made to gather the scattered memory into one dedicated, secure, and organized place. The secret archive was formally born from this act of bureaucratic consolidation. Imagine the scene. Scribes and librarians bringing carts of ancient parchment from various dark corners of the apostolic palace. Dusty scrolls, bound codices, bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. For the first time, the papacy was given its own history of permanent, organized home. This was an act of respect for the past and of responsibility for the future. But in that very act, something subtle and profound also occurred. By centralizing this memory, by giving it walls and locks and guardians, the Church was also centralizing control over its own narrative. The archive became the definitive authoritative source. What was within its walls was preserved truth. What was outside was less certain. This was not a malicious plan, but a natural outcome of order. Systems, by their design, create boundaries. And the most formidable system is one built to last for eternity. To step into the Vatican Apostolic Archive today, a privilege granted only to rigorously vetted academic researchers, is to step into a universe of silent, ordered paper. It is not a single, gloomy cavern. It is over 85 kilometers of shelving, winding through multiple buildings and underground bunkers. It is a climate-controlled, meticulously cataloged city of words. There are grand, beautiful rooms like the Sala Sistina, with frescoed ceilings and marble floors, where scholars sit at long wooden desks under the gaze of saints painted centuries ago. And there are stark, modern, fluorescent-lit corridors where steel shelves hold more recent files. The archive has a rhythm, a heartbeat set by the quiet turning of pages and the soft click of a microfilm reader. Its guardians are the archivists and prefects, scholars themselves who move with a calm, unhurried reverence. They are not gatekeepers in the sinister sense, but curators of an immense and fragile trust. Their primary mission is preservation. A parchment from the 8th century, a papal bull from the 13th to a letter from a Renaissance prince. These are physical objects vulnerable to light, to humidity, to the oils on human fingers. Every request for a document is filtered through this imperative of protection. This is the first and most genuine layer of secrecy, the protection of the physical artifact from destruction. The second layer is one of protocol and privacy. Not all documents are open for research. There is a moving wall of secrecy. As a general rule, archives are open to scholars up to the end of the pontificate of Pius XII in 1958. Everything after remains closed, part of the living, sensitive administrative memory of the Holy See. This rule is about sovereignty and diplomatic discretion as much as anything else. But within the open sections there are further, subtler filters. The catalog itself, the massive, multi-volume guide to what is where is a masterpiece of minimal disclosure. An entry might read, Lettere diverse, section 16, diverse letters, 16th century. To know what those letters contain, you must order the box, wait for it to be brought from the depths, and then read through perhaps hundreds of unrelated documents. Discovery is not streamlined. It is an act of archaeological patience. There is no searchable digital database for most of this material. Knowledge here must be earned with time, with persistence, and with a tolerance for overwhelming, undifferentiated information. This is the true nature of the secret library. Its power lies less in dramatic locks on forbidden doors, and more in the sheer, staggering, silent volume of what it holds. A secret can hide not behind a barrier, but simply by being one unremarkable page among 50 million. The mystery is not if something is hidden, but how anything is ever found. And in that ocean of paper, it becomes entirely plausible that a manuscript, a gospel, a letter quoting a lost teaching, could be perfectly preserved, meticulously cataloged, and yet remain essentially invisible, not because it's forbidden, but because it is a single silent thread in a tapestry of unimaginable size. The archive's greatest secret may be its own boundless, overwhelming ordinariness. To comprehend the possibility of a lost scripture, you must first envision a world in which scriptures were born. Picture the first centuries after the life of Jesus of Nazareth. There is no New Testament. There is no unified church structure with a central publishing authority. There are communities in Jerusalem, Antioch, Ephesus, Rome, Alexandria, scattered across the Roman Empire and beyond. These communities are connected by traveling teachers, by letters, by shared hope, but they are also separated by distance, culture, and language. In each place, the story of Jesus is told and retold. His parables, his miracles, his teachings on the kingdom of God, his death and resurrection. This story is living memory, passed orally from those who claim to be eyewitnesses to their disciples, to new converts. It is a story told in Aramaic, in Greek, in Coptic. It is adapted, emphasized, and interpreted through the lens of local needs and existing religious thought. A community facing persecution might emphasize Jesus' words on suffering and endurance. A community of Greek philosophers might dwell on his teachings about the Logos, the divine word. This was not a conspiracy to alter the message. It was a natural, human process of profound experience, taking root in different soils. And soon, the fragility of memory became a concern. What if the eyewitnesses died? What if the stories changed in telling? And so, writing began, not with the goal of creating a single authoritative book, but with the simple, urgent need to preserve. A leader in Rome writes down what he learned from Peter. A teacher in Egypt collects the sayings of Jesus he finds most meaningful. A community in Syria compiles a narrative of his life. These are the first Gospels, letters, and revelations. They are local treasures, copied and shared with neighboring communities. For a long, fluid period, there was a vibrant multiplicity. The Gospel of Matthew circulated alongside the Gospel of Thomas. The letters of Paul were read alongside the Shepherd of Hermas or the Didache. There was debate, of course. Some writings were more popular. Some were viewed with skepticism, but the idea of a fixed closed canon, an official list of books that alone constituted scripture, was a development of later centuries. In this early fertile chaos, texts lived or died by their utility and their resonance. If a text spoke powerfully to a community, it was copied. If it ceased to be relevant, copying slowed, then stopped. And in the ancient world, to stop being copied was a death sentence. Papyrus crumbles. Ink fades. Mice nibble. A fire, a flood, a simple decision to reuse the parchment for another text. These were the quiet, unrecorded endings for countless manuscripts. This was the first and most profound filter. Neglect. The vast majority of early Christian writings vanished this way, not through malice, but through silence. They were not forbidden. They were forgotten. But as the Christian movement grew from a scattered collection of communities into an institutional force within the Roman Empire, a new kind of filtering began. Unity became a matter of survival. To present a coherent identity to the outside world and to maintain order within, leaders began to feel the need for doctrinal clarity, which teachings were essential, which interpretations led to stability, and which to fragmentation. In the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, bishops and theologians engaged in intense debates over the nature of Christ, over the relationship between faith and law, over the authority of emerging church structures. In these debates, texts became weapons. A group advocating a particular view would naturally appeal to the scriptures that supported their position. Their opponents would question the authenticity or authority of those same texts. Church councils, like the Pivotal Council of Nicaea in 325, were convened to settle these disputes and define orthodoxy, correct belief. In the wake of these councils, the process of canonization gradually took shape. Lists of approved books were drawn up. Criteria were established. Apostolic authorship or connection, widespread use, consistency with the rule of faith. This was not a single dramatic event where a committee voted on the Bible. It was a slow, organic, often contentious process of consensus building across the Mediterranean world. And in this process, some texts that had once been widely respected found themselves marginalized. They might be deemed not apostolic enough or too recently composed. They might contain themes or stories that seem to clash with the emerging consensus. For example, texts that emphasize a purely spiritual, non-suffering Christ, or those that propose complex layers of divine beings, were increasingly viewed as out of bounds. The response to these texts varied. Some were openly condemned and, where possible, destroyed, though such destruction was likely less widespread than later legend would suggest. A more common fate was simply to stop copying them within the mainstream Orthodox communities. They were not collected in the great scriptoria where Bibles were reproduced. They were allowed to fade on the edges. However, and this is a crucial point, they did not always disappear completely. They often survived in pockets, in distant monastic libraries, or among groups labeled heretical. A text declared unacceptable in Rome might continue to be copied and revered in a monastery in Upper Egypt or Mesopotamia. This geographical and cultural fragmentation of the ancient world is key to the mystery. A scripture could be lost to the Latin West while still being found and preserved in the Syriac East or the Coptic South. It was not a global deletion, but a removal from a specific, dominant stream of tradition. The library of a powerful, centralizing institution, like the Church of Rome, would over time come to reflect this curated tradition. Its active collection would house the approved, the canonical, the theologically safe. But what are the other texts? The ones that arrived at its doors from those distant pockets? The ones referenced in ancient letters in its own archives? Would they be thrown into the fire? Or would they perhaps be given a different fate? A fate not of destruction but of sequestration. Placed in a box, given a label, and stored in the private archive, the secretum, where they would cease to be part of the living tradition, and become instead a historical artifact, a piece of evidence, but not a source of faith. This is a transition point, from texts being lost by natural decay or theological rejection, to texts being placed into administrative custody. And it is at this precise point that the story of the Vatican archives becomes a story of the vanished gospel. The trail of a lost text does not begin with the text itself. It begins with its echo, a ghostly imprint left in the historical record, a reference to something that is no longer there. To find these echoes, we must become listeners in a hall of whispers. We must read the writings of the early church fathers, the theologians, the apologists, and bishops whose works did survive, not only for their own arguments, but for the shadows of other arguments they reveal. Often they quote, paraphrase, or angrily denounce teachings they attribute to rival groups. In doing so, they inadvertently preserve fragments of text that have otherwise vanished. Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon, writing around 180 AD, in his massive work Against Heresies, provides a detailed catalog of Gnostic beliefs. He describes their complex cosmologies, their reinterpretations of Genesis, their secret gospels. He quotes from them to refute them. While his purpose was to condemn, his effect was to preserve a skeletal outline of their thought. He mentions, for instance, a gospel of truth used by the Valentinians. For centuries, this was just a name in Irenaeus' polemic. Then in 1945, among the Nag Hammadi codices in Egypt, a complete Coptic version of the Gospel of Truth was found. The echo had a source. Similarly, Origen of Alexandria in the 3rd century and Eusebius of Caesarea in the 4th, in their own scholarly works, sometimes list or describe early Christian writings. Eusebius, in his church history, provides one of the earliest known categorizations. Books that were universally acknowledged, books that were disputed, and books that were spurious. In the spurious category, he lists texts like the Gospel of Peter and the Acts of Paul. He doesn't describe their contents in detail, but his mere listing is a clue. It tells us these books existed, were known to educated Christians of his time, but were not part of the core tradition he was documenting. These mentions are like footnotes in history that have lost their main text. Then there are the papal and conciliar decrees. The Gelasian decree, a document likely from the 6th century, though attributed to an earlier pope, provides another list of approved and disapproved books. It condemns, among others, the books of the Nazarenes, the infancy gospel of Thomas, and the book called the Assumption of Holy Mary. The decree doesn't order their burning. It simply states they are not to be received. For a text to be not received by the central authority was a death sentence for its canonical status. Its copies would not be made in the important scriptoria. It would slowly retreat to the fringes. But a copy might still exist somewhere in a monastery library that didn't get the memo, or in a private collection. More tantalizing than outright condemnations are the oblique, almost casual references. A letter between two bishops discussing a point of doctrine, where one says, "As it is written in the book of the elders," but no book by that name survives in our canon. A marginal note in an early manuscript of a canonical gospel, where a scribe has written. This differs from the account in the Gospel of the Hebrews. A library inventory from a medieval monastery that lists among its holdings Evangelium Secundum Egyptios, the Gospel according to the Egyptians. When scholars centuries later searched that monastery's collection, that particular codex is gone. Was it destroyed? Was it stolen? Or was it at some point sent to a central archive for safekeeping or review and never returned? These are the quiet disturbances. They are not proof of a grand suppression, but they are evidence of a ragged, incomplete historical record. They point to a past that was richer, more diverse, and more complicated than the streamlined version that came down to us. Vatican archives themselves hold some of these tantalizing clues within their own catalogs. There are entries that are curiously vague. Codex Membranaceus, continens various scripta apocrypha. A parchment codex containing various apocryphal writings. Which apocrypha? The entry doesn't say. To know, you must request a codex. And sometimes the codex is listed as non-consultable. Not consultable due to its fragile state or for reasons of internal review. This is where archival protocol and historical mystery intersect. The protection of a fragile object is a perfectly legitimate, non-sinister reason to restrict access, but the effect is the same. Silence. The whisper grows fainter. The scholar is turned away. The entry remains a dead end. Over decades and centuries, these small moments, a vague catalog entry, a restrictive protocol, a text cited but not seen, accumulate. They create a pattern of absence, a pattern that suggests that within the vast, ordered system of memory, there are not just random gaps, but structured silences, places where the record was not lost, but was deliberately retired from active duty. These first mentions, these scattered echoes, are the coordinates we have. They don't lead us to a treasure chest. They lead us to a door. And on that door is not a sign that says, "Here be secrets," but a sign that says, "Archival storage, access restricted." The most powerful secrets are not the ones shouted. They are the ones filed correctly under a neutral, bureaucratic label. If we are to imagine what kind of scriptures might have been led into that restricted storage, we must move beyond labels like heretical and think in terms of tension. Tension with emerging authority. Tension with evolving dogma. Tension with the very structure of an institutional church. Let us consider a few themes, not as proven contents of a specific lost book, but as the kind of spiritual currents that, if given powerful voice in a text, might have caused that text to be set aside. The first, and perhaps most profound, is the tension between external authority and internal revelation. The canonical Gospels certainly contain teachings on an intimate, personal relationship with God. But as the Church developed its hierarchy of bishops, its sacramental system, and its defined doctrines, the emphasis increasingly fell on the Church as the necessary mediator of grace and truth. Now, imagine a gospel, perhaps one used by an early charismatic or mystical community, that placed overwhelming emphasis on the inner light. A text where Jesus says, "The kingdom of God is within you and around you, but you do not see it. When you come and know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father." This is not a rejection of community or teaching, but it subtly shifts the center of gravity. Salvation, understanding, divinity, they are not something administered to you, but something you awaken to within. For leaders try and build a unified, disciplined, universal community, such a teaching could be seen as dangerously individualistic. It could undermine the need for a teaching authority, for priestly intercession, for the very structures being built to sustain the faith across generations. This text wouldn't be false. It might even be inspiring, but it would be politically and theologically inconvenient at a crucial moment of institutional formation. Its fate might not be condemnation, but gentle sidelining. It would be copied less, cited less in official homilies, and eventually find its home only in libraries specializing in curiosities. A second theme is the human portrait of Jesus. The canonical Gospels present a profound blend of humanity and divinity, but different communities lean different ways. Some in reaction to heresies that denied Jesus' true humanity, emphasize his divinity to the point where his human experiences could seem almost theatrical. What if a lost gospel leaned hard the other way? What if it contained stories of Jesus as a child, not performing miracles of vengeance, but simply learning, asking questions, feeling doubt or loneliness? What if it depicted him in moments of deep emotional vulnerability, weeping not just for Lazarus, but in confusion or fear? What if it showed him laughing, joking, forming deep friendships of simple human affection? Such a portrait would make him immensely relatable, deeply human. But for a theology that was increasingly defining him in precise metaphysical terms, fully God and fully man, one person with two natures, an overly human, emotionally granular portrait could be problematic. It could make the doctrine seem abstract and distant from the relatable figure in the text. It might raise uncomfortable questions. If he learned, did he not know everything? If he felt true fear, was his divine nature separate? Rather than wrestling with these complexities, it might have been easier for curators of the tradition to let such a text, if existed, recede into the background. It would be seen as overly simplistic, perhaps even naive, suitable for popular piety, but not for the serious philosophical theology of the educated clergy. A third theme is universalism versus particularity. The early church wrestled with its relationship to Judaism and to the wider pagan world. Some texts pushed toward radical inclusion. The Gospel of Philip, found at Nag Hammadi, uses mystical language about unity that transcends conventional boundaries. What if a lost gospel presented Jesus, who explicitly and repeatedly reached out to Gentiles, Samaritans, Romans, and social outcasts in a way that implicitly critiqued any form of religious or ethnic exclusivity? While the book of Acts and the letters of Paul deal with this issue, a gospel where this was a central, driving theme could have been a powerful tool for one side of the debate. If it was associated with a group that lost a theological or political struggle over the church's identity, its scripture might have been marginalized along with them. It wouldn't be banned. It would just become associated with a defeated perspective and thus cease to be copied by the winning side. Its voice would fade not because it was wrong, but because its faction was no longer in charge of the copying machines. These are the kinds of scriptures that raise questions. They don't attack the core story. They reframe it. They don't deny the divine. They describe it differently. Their danger is not in their falsehood, but in their alternative emphasis. They offer a different lens, and institutions in the process of standardization often have a deep, instinctual distrust of alternative lenses. The preferred lens becomes the only lens. The other lenses are not shattered. They are simply placed in a drawer labeled other perspectives, and the drawer is locked, not out of hatred for what's inside, but out of a fervent belief in the supreme importance of what is outside in the light. To label an action hiding carries an accusation of bad faith, but from the perspective of the institution itself, across the span of centuries, the act might be framed very differently, as protection, as stewardship, as pastoral responsibility. We must step into this mindset to understand the logic, not to excuse it, but to comprehend its historical force. First, consider the principle of protecting the faithful. The early church fathers often used medical metaphors. Heresy was a poison, a disease. The bishop was a doctor of souls. If a text contained teachings deemed spiritually harmful, teachings that could lead believers into error, despair, or pride, the pastoral duty was to quarantine it. This wasn't about hiding truth. It was about preventing spiritual infection. A text teaching that the material world was utterly evil, for instance, could lead to a hatred creation or to a libertine disregard for body, since it was seen as worthless. A text promising secret knowledge to an elite few could foster spiritual arrogance and fractured community. From this viewpoint, restricting access to such texts was an act of love akin to keeping a dangerous medicine on a high shelf away from children. The Vatican archive, in part, functions as that high shelf. It preserves the text for scholarly study. The doctors can still examine the disease, understand it, but it removes it from general circulation where it could cause harm. Second, there is the imperative of unity. Christianity's survival and growth amidst persecution and a pluralistic Roman world depended critically on its internal cohesion. See how they love one another was an early pagan observation. Doctrinal chaos, public squabbling over competing scriptures would have shattered that witness. When Constantine legalized Christianity and it moved from the catacombs to the halls of power, unity became even more politically essential. The church was now a pillar of the social order. A fragmented church meant a fragmented empire. Councils were called to establish unity of belief. Texts that fueled division, even if containing elements of truth, were seen as a threat to the greater good, the peace and unity of the oikumene, the whole inhabited world. Placing such a text in a secure archive neutralized it as an active agent of discord. It was disarmed. Its controversial ideas were captured and contained like a volatile substance sealed in a lead flask. It remained part of the historical record, but ceased to be part of the living theological conversation. This is institutional triage. In a crisis of unity, you stabilize the patient by isolating the source of the bleed. Third, and more subtly, is the protection of the text itself. This may seem paradoxical, but it is a key function of archives. A text that is controversial is often a text that is vulnerable. It could be destroyed by overzealous opponents. It could be altered by partisans to support their side. By bringing it into the secure, climate-controlled, ordered environment of a central archive, the Church ensured its physical survival in an authentic state. The text is hidden from the public, yes, but it is also saved from the vagaries of history. It becomes a museum piece. Its meaning is frozen. It can no longer be used as a rallying cry in contemporary battles, but it is preserved for future historians to study in a calmer time. This is the ultimate long-term thinking of an institution that measures time in millennia. The archive says, in effect, this idea is too potent, too destabilizing for our present age. We will not destroy it, for it is part of our story, but we will put it to sleep here in this vault until the world or the Church is mature enough, secure enough to examine it without fracture. There is a profound paternalism in this, but also a profound sense of historical stewardship. The Church sees itself not just as a teacher for today, but as the guardian of a 2,000-year tradition for all time. Its actions are judged not by the standards of modern academic freedom, but by the ancient logic of a shepherd protecting a flock from wolves, and even, perhaps, from certain paths that lead off a cliff. From the outside, this looks like secrecy and control. From the inside, it can look like prudence and love. The Vatican Secret Library is the physical manifestation of this tension. It is where prudence stores what love has decided the flock is not yet ready to see. Whether this is wisdom or oppression is a question that lies not in the archives, but in the heart of the believer and the mind of the historian forever in dialogue. They come not with torches and crowbars, but with letters of recommendation, white cotton gloves, and a patient, grinding dedication. They are the scholars, paleographers, historians of theology, codicologists, for whom the Vatican archives are not a fortress of myth, but a workplace of profound, frustrating, and occasionally exhilarating possibility. Their quest is not for a singular forbidden text, but for knowledge, to fill in the gaps, to connect the dot, to understand the full, messy, complicated story of Christian thought. Their stories are not dramatic breakthroughs, but slow, cumulative insight built over decades of polite requests, careful note-taking, and dead ends. One such figure, emblematic of this long 19th and early 20th century effort, was a German church historian Ludwig von Pastor. Granted unprecedented access to write his multi-volume history of the popes, he spent years in the archives. He wasn't looking for suppressed gospels. He was reconstructing papal politics, diplomacy, and daily life. Yet, in his meticulous footnotes, he would occasionally reference documents that seemed to point to wider holdings. He might note, see also the unpublished correspondence on the Clementine, Review of Apocryphal Texts, Archvat, Arm 4, Volume 12. A trail left for others. These trails were followed by scholars like Monsignor Angelo Mercati, an archivist himself, who in the early 1900s began the Herculean task of creating better, more public catalogs. He knew better than anyone what the archives held, and his published guides sometimes contained brief, tantalizing descriptions of collections that were not fully open. He operated within the system, a loyal servant of the Church, but his scholarly drive was to make the hidden less hidden. His work was an act of controlled release, opening windows where before there were only blank walls. In the mid-20th century, a different kind of scholar emerged, catalyzed by the Nag Hammadi discovery. Suddenly, lost gospels were real, physical objects. Scholars like Gilles Quispel, a Dutch historian of religion, became detectives.
Having worked on the Nag Hammadi texts, he turned his eyes to Rome. He knew that some of the Coptic texts were likely translations of earlier Greek originals. Could any of those Greek originals have ever made their way to Vatican? He began to study the acquisition history of the Vatican Library. He looked at inventories from the Renaissance, when popes and cardinals aggressively collected ancient manuscripts from across the collapsing Byzantine world. He found records of shipments from monasteries in Greece and Constantinople. In one inventory, he found a vague listing, a Greek codex, very ancient, containing sayings of the Lord of doubtful orthodoxy. Where was that codex now? Quispel, like others, applied for access. Sometimes he was granted it, and spent months poring over manuscripts, comparing handwriting, tracing paper sources. More often, he was told a manuscript was under review or too fragile for consultation. There was never a confrontation, never a refusal that spoke of dark secrets, only the smooth, impenetrable language of bureaucracy. Procedures conservation concerns prior commitments. The scholar's most formidable opponent was not a menacing guard, but a polite archivist citing Regulation 7b, subsection 2. The quest became a marathon of endurance, of building relationships, of publishing enough credible work to justify the next, more specific request. It was a game of chess played over years, where the scholar's moves were articles and footnotes, and the archive's moves were delays and conditional permissions. Then there are the internal seekers, priests and theologians within the church who, driven by intellectual passion, sought to explore the boundaries of their own tradition. The Jesuit scholar Roberto Busa, in the mid-20th century, sought permission to use early computing technology to create a concordance of the works of Thomas Aquinas. To do this, he needed access to the earliest, best manuscripts, many in the Vatican. His project was orthodox, even pious in its aim, but it required a level of access and a new technological method that made the archivists nervous. Through sheer persistence and the patronage of powerful figures, he succeeded. His work opened doors, not just for his project, but for a new understanding of what collaboration between the archives and technology could look like. His story shows that persistence and a non-threatening, academically rigorous approach could sometimes slowly shift the boundaries of the possible. These scholars, from Vaughan Pastor to Busa, to the countless anonymous researchers sitting in the Sala Sistina today, form a continuous chain. They are the ones who translate the archive silence into a whisper, and the whisper into a sentence, and the sentence into a paragraph of history. They do not find the Ark of the Covenant. They find a ledger entry from 1583 that mentions a book that was sent from a monastery in Crete. They cross-reference it with a letter from a cardinal complaining about unusual doctrines in a text he reviewed. They publish a paper suggesting a possible lineage for a known apocryphal text. Their work is granular, unglamorous, and essential. They are the reason we know the whispers exist at all. They are the human bridge between the vault's silence and the world's curiosity. Their collective effort is a slow, gentle pressure on the door, not to break it down, but to convince the guardians, through demonstrated responsibility and scholarly merit, that it might be safe to let it open just a crack wider. Let us move deeper, past the public reading rooms where scholars work, into the architectural and administrative heart of the secret. The Vatican archives are a physical organism, and like any organism, they have a surface layer and protected inner systems. There are no literal hidden rooms in the sense of secret chambers behind moving bookcases, though the romantic mind wishes it were so. The reality is both more mundane and, in its way, more effective. The secrecy is achieved through zoning, not concealment. The entire archive is, of course, a restricted zone, but within it, there are further invisible boundaries. The first is the catalog boundary. As mentioned, the published catalogs are guides. not comprehensive inventories. They point to large collections, but not to every individual item. To navigate, you need an internal, unpublished index or the memory of the archivists. This is the first hidden room. It exists not in space, but in information. The room is made of knowledge about where things are, and that knowledge is held in the minds of select few. The second boundary is the conservation boundary. The Fondo Riservato, or reserve collection, contains materials deemed too fragile for any handling. These could be papal account books from the 13th century with crumbling edges or water-damaged scrolls. Their contents may be entirely mundane, but their physical state renders them hidden. No conspiracy is needed. The passage of time has drawn the veil. A gospel fragment could sit here, not because of its message, but because its parchment is too brittle to unroll. The third and most significant is the administrative boundary. This includes the Pope's personal archive, which remains closed for a long period. It also includes documents pertaining to ongoing canonical processes, delicate diplomatic relations, or the internal governance of the Holy See. Access here is not about theology, but about sovereignty and operational privacy. This is where the modern secret truly resides. It's the cabinet of a global head of state, not the chest of a medieval sorcerer. But there is a fourth layer, more nebulous. Let's call it the disciplinary boundary. This is where the concerns of earlier chapters become operational. Within the vast holdings, there are collections that have been flagged at some point in history as containing theologically sensitive material. These might be the personal papers of a cardinal investigated for heterodox views, or the complete library of a suppressed religious order. These collections were seized, inventoried, and stored. They were not destroyed because they were evidence or simply property. Over time, the urgent reason for their sequestration faded, but they remained in their designated, restricted boxes. To access them, a scholar doesn't just need permission to enter the archives. They need special, additional permission from a higher authority, often a specific congregation or commission within the curia, to consult that specific fondo. The request must justify why the sensitive material is necessary for their research. The decision is not made by an archivist, but by a theologian administrator. This process adds months or years to a research project. For many scholars, it's a barrier too high. They design their project around what is accessible, not what might be fascinating. Thus, these collections slumber unknown to exist, but functionally hidden by a layer of bureaucratic permission. They are in the building, but not in the usable library. This is the modern restricted vault. It has no iron door or combination lock. It has a committee and a filing cabinet in an office. Its security is not physical, but procedural, and it is arguably more secure than any lock, because it is defended by the most formidable force of all, institutional habit. Finally, we must consider the sheer, overwhelming scale as a form of hiding. In over 85 kilometers of shelves, the single codex is a needle in a universe of haystacks. It can be lost simply by being misfiled one time centuries ago. A 15th century archivist, dealing with a flood of new material from the East after the fall of Constantinople, might have placed a box of Greek manuscripts in a section labeled Miscellanea Graeca Theological. A 19th century archivist recataloging might have moved that box to a new numbering system, but the cross-reference in the old catalog was lost. Today that box exists. It is not forbidden. It is not in a secret room. It is sitting on shelf 94, row 12, corridor 7 of the underground bunker. But without the path to find it, it might as well be on the moon. The archive's final and greatest secret keeper is its own majestic, inhuman size. The hidden rooms are not chambers. They are gaps in the map. The restricted vaults are not cells. They are labels on a folder in a system understood by fewer and fewer people with each passing generation. To find something here, you need more than a key. You need a thread through the labyrinth. And those threads are often broken, leaving even the most innocent of texts in perpetual, unplanned, and perfect obscurity. History has a way of appending our certainties, of pulling back curtains we thought were permanent walls. The most powerful argument that texts can survive centuries of silence is not a theory, but a fact. Two discoveries in the 20th century rewrote the rulebook on what was possible. They are the Nag Hammadi Library and the Dead Sea Scrolls. They stand as monumental proof that entire libraries of lost, sacred literature can endure in the earth, waiting for a chance moment to return. Let's begin in Upper Egypt. 1945. A farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Salman is digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi. His mattock strikes not soil, but pottery. He uncovers a large, sealed jar. Fearing a jinn, a spirit, he hesitates. But thoughts of treasure overcome fear. He breaks the jar open. Inside, he finds not gold, but books. 13 ancient codices, bound in leather, filled with papyrus pages. He bundles them up and takes them home. They are eventually sold on the black market, piece by piece, winding through antiquities dealers. It takes years for scholars to realize what has been found. These were Coptic translations from the 4th century of much earlier Greek texts. They contained over 50 separate works. Among them were complete copies of Gospels and spiritual treatises that had been known only by name from the refutations of church fathers like Irenaeus. The Gospel of Thomas, a collection of 114 sayings of Jesus. The Gospel of Philip, a mystical reflection on sacrament and unity. The Gospel of Truth, mentioned by Irenaeus. The apocrypha of John, an entire cosmology and spirituality, belonging to a branch of early Christianity later labeled Gnostic, had been preserved not in the great libraries of Rome or Constantinople, but in a jar in the Egyptian desert, buried by monks who perhaps saw the tide of orthodoxy rising and chose to hide their treasured books rather than see them destroyed. This was not a text slowly fading from copying. This was a library deliberately cached for safekeeping. Its rediscovery was an earthquake. It proved that loss could mean waiting. It proved that the historical record was not just missing pages, but missing whole chapters preserved in geographical and cultural pockets far from the centers of power. A few years later, between 1947 and 1956, another discovery echoed this lesson, this time from the Judean desert near the Dead Sea. A Bedouin shepherd throwing a rock into a cave heard the sound of breaking pottery. Investigating, he found clay jars containing ancient scrolls. These were the first of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Eventually, over 900 manuscripts were found in 11 caves. They included every book of the Hebrew Bible, except Esther, copied 1,000 years earlier than the oldest previously known manuscripts. They included unknown psalms, commentaries, community rules, and apocalyptic texts belonging to a Jewish sect, likely the Essenes from around the time of Jesus. This was not a Christian library, but its implications were staggering for biblical history. It showed that textual variation was the norm, not the exception, in antiquity. It showed that multiple versions of scriptures circulated simultaneously. Most importantly, it showed once again that the dry, stable climate of a desert cave could be a perfect time capsule, preserving fragile organic materials for 2 millennia. The scrolls were not hidden by a church authority. They were hidden by a community facing destruction from Roman armies. But the principle was the same. When faced with erasure, you bury your library. You hope that the earth will remember what men may forget. These twin discoveries change the question about the Vatican archives from a speculative what if to a grounded why not. If desert caves and Egyptian jars can preserve entire libraries against all odds, what is the preservation power of the most sophisticated, controlled, and dedicated archival system in the world, purpose-built for endurance? The Vatican's vaults are the antithesis
of a desert cave. They are climate-controlled, guarded, and maintained by a continuous, unbroken institution. If a text entered that system, even a text deemed problematic, its chances of physical survival are exponentially higher than if it had remained in a monastery library prone to fire, flood, or neglect. The archives are, in a sense, the ultimate clay jar. Their purpose is not to forget, but to remember selectively. The Nag Hammadi in Qumran finds demonstrate that the act of hiding can be an act of preservation. The monks who buried the Nag Hammadi codices were hiding them from orthodox authorities. In doing so, they saved them from modernity. By analogy, if a controversial text was placed in the Vatican's restrictive fondo centuries ago, the curators of that time were, in their view, hiding it from the faithful to protect doctrine. But in the cold, neutral eye of history, they were also effectively preserving it for future scholars. They were placing it in the ultimate clay jar. The difference is, we know where this jar is. We can see its outline. We just can't lift the lid without permission. These real-world discoveries shatter the myth of permanent loss. They tell us that texts have a stubborn will to survive. They migrate to the margins. They are buried in the earth. They are sealed in vaults. They go underground in every sense of the word. And from that underground, they sometimes erupt back into the light, carrying voices we thought were silenced forever. The question for the Vatican archives is no longer about capability, but about choice. The desert gave up its secrets by accident. Will the archive ever choose to do so? If you write to the prefect of the Vatican Apostolic Archive or the prefect of the Vatican Library and ask directly, "Do you have forbidden scriptures locked away?" you will not receive a sensational answer. You will receive a calm, precise, and institutionally crafted reply. The official position is a masterclass in navigating the space between disclosure and discretion. It rests on several pillars, each designed to diffuse speculation while maintaining absolute control. The first pillar is terminology. The Church does not use the word forbidden in this context for ancient texts. The preferred term is non-canonical or apocryphal. These are neutral academic descriptors. They mean the texts are not part of the official canon of Scripture. They are historical documents, not sources of doctrine. This reframes the issue entirely. It's not about hiding dangerous truth. It's about classifying different types of historical sources. The second pillar is purpose. Officials state unequivocally that the archives exist for two primary reasons: to preserve the historical patrimony of the Holy See and to serve serious scholarly research. The emphasis is always on serious and qualified. Access is a privilege granted for academic purposes, not a public right or an invitation for sensationalism. The third pillar is practical limitation. They point to the sheer volume and fragility of the material. Only a tiny fraction of the holdings can be digitized or made publicly available at any time. Prioritization is necessary. Materials are open for research based on scholarly interest, conservation status, and the internal work of cataloging. A delay, therefore, is not a refusal. It is a cue. When pressed on specific texts like those mentioned in old catalogs, the response moves to a fourth pillar: scholarly prudence. They might say that many old catalog entries are vague, that the identification of manuscript is a complex science, and that what a 17th century librarian called a dubious gospel might, upon modern examination, turn out to be a well-known patristic homily or a fragment of canonical text with unusual glosses. They caution against jumping to conclusions based on a line in an inventory. This is a reasonable scholarly point. It serves to lower the temperature, to redirect excitement back into the slow, careful channels of academic peer review. The fifth and most definitive pillar is the opening of the archives. Pope after pope in the modern era has ordered sections of the archives to be opened earlier than the traditional rule. Pope Leo XIII made a landmark opening to scholars in 1881.
More recently, Pope Benedict XVI opened the archives of Pius XII, a hugely significant and controversial move. And Pope Francis has continued this policy of transparency for earlier periods. The institution points to this progressive opening as proof of its goodwill and lack of things to hide. It says, "See, we are revealing our past, even its difficult chapters. There is no single dark secret. But within this calm official stance, there remains a profound and eloquent silence. The Church never issues a definitive blanket statement saying, 'We possess no unknown Gospels or significant non-canonical texts beyond those already known to scholarship.' To do so would be make a claim about the contents of 85 kilometers of uncatalogued or partially cataloged material, an impossible claim. Nor does it actively promote the existence of such texts. The official position is one of study neutrality toward the possibility. It neither confirms nor denies the specific whispers. This neutrality is strategic. Confirmation would create a media frenzy and endless specific requests. Denial would be historically reckless and could be proven false by a future discovery within its own walls. So it says nothing. It speaks around the question. It discusses process, not content. It offers transparency on its schedule, not on its shelves. This institutional silence is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of a vast, unexamined room. It is the silence of an archive doing its job. Preserving, not interpreting. Controlling access, not granting it. For the curious, this is the most frustrating answer of all. It is not a no. It is the question is not appropriate. It redirects you from the what to the how. And in that redirection, the mystery is not solved. It is simply placed back into the filing system under pending. The official position, in the end, is a perfectly maintained door. It has a sign that says archives. It has hours of operation. It has rules for entry. But it never tells you what's inside. It only tells you how you might, one day, if you are worthy and patient, be allowed to go in and look for yourself. This is the genius of the position. It replaces conspiracy with procedure. It transforms a quest for hidden knowledge into an application for a reading room pass. And in doing so, it maintains an eternal, gentle, and unbreakable control. Let us engage in a thought experiment of profound consequence. Imagine that tomorrow, the prefect of the Vatican archives holds a press conference. He announces that during a routine inventory, a previously misclassified box was discovered. And it is a Greek codex from the 3rd century. After expert analysis, it is confirmed to be a previously unknown gospel, a complete text. It is not a fragment, not a quotation, but a full narrative. He states that in the spirit of historical transparency, the digitized text and a scholarly translation will be released online for all to see. The world holds its breath. The file is published. What happens? The initial tremor will be felt not in churches, but in universities, departments of religious studies. History and classics would erupt. Scholars would scramble to be the first to analyze, to contextualize, to publish. The initial wave would be a tsunami of pure, unadulterated scholarship. Comparisons would be drawn to every known gospel, canonical and non-canonical. Its language would be parsed, its theology decoded, its possible community of origin hypothesized. Conferences would be organized within weeks. The text would be pulled apart, reassembled and debated with an intensity not seen since the release of the Nag Hammadi texts. This would not be a crisis of faith. It would be the academic event of the century. For historians, it would be a new primary source, a new window into the diversity of the early Christian movement. It would fill gaps, confirm theories, or demolish old assumptions. Its value would be immense regardless of its content. Then the wave would reach the shores of faith. For believers, the impact would be deeply varied. For some, particularly those with fundamentalist or literalist view of Scripture, it could be deeply unsettling. The idea of a new gospel challenges the concept of a closed canon of finished revelation. It could be seen as an attack on the authority of the Bible they know. There might be rejection, anger, or confusion. For others, especially in more scholarly or mystical traditions, the reaction would be more nuanced. They already accept that the canon was formed historically and that other inspired writings exist. A new text would be seen not as a replacement, but as an enrichment, a new voice in the ancient chorus. It might offer a fresh perspective on a parable, a new saying of Jesus to meditate upon, a different emphasis on his ministry. It could deepen spirituality rather than shatter it. For these believers, faith is not a fragile vase threatened by new information, but a living tree that can grow around new historical knowledge. The real challenge would be for church leadership. They would have to craft a pastoral response. They would likely reiterate the distinction between canonical scripture, the normative rule of faith, and other ancient Christian writings, valuable historical witnesses. They would emphasize that the discovery does not change doctrine, which is based on the apostolic tradition as a whole, not on any single text. They would guide the faithful in how to read and understand the new gospel within the wider context of church teaching. It would be a moment of catechesis, not panic, on a broader cultural level. The release would fuel a new public fascination with Christian origins. Documentaries, books, and articles would proliferate. The cultural conversation about religion, history, and secrecy would be revitalized. But perhaps the most significant change would be within the Vatican itself. Releasing such a text would represent a monumental shift in self-understanding. It would be an admission that the archive is not just a storage unit for the past, but an active participant in the discovery of truth. It would signal a move from a custodial model, protecting the faithful from complexity, to a collaborative model, partnering with the world in pursuit of historical understanding. It would require a level of trust and maturity of both the faithful and the secular world that is historically unprecedented. The act of release would be more revolutionary than the content of the text. It would say, we are no longer afraid of our own history. We are confident enough in our faith and our tradition to let all the voices, even the unfamiliar ones, be heard. That confidence could be the most transformative revelation of all. The text itself might not change doctrine, but the act of revealing it could change everything about how the institution relates to its past and to our shared quest for understanding. As our journey through whispers and archives, through history and silence, draws to a close, we are left not with an answer, but with a deeper, more resonant question. It is a question that hangs in the air long after the last word narration fades. What else remains locked away? Not just in the vaults of the Vatican, but in the vaults of history itself? In the unexcavated ruins of monasteries, in the forgotten storerooms of ancient churches, in the private collections of families who have forgotten what their ancestors placed there for safekeeping. The story of the possibly vanished gospel is a single thread in a vast tapestry of human forgetting. We have built civilizations, libraries, digital clouds to remember, and yet forgetting is a default state of the past. For every Gospel of Thomas found at Nag Hammadi, how many other testaments were consumed by damp or fire? For every Dead Sea Scroll preserved in a jar, how many disintegrated into dust in a sack on a camel's back? The Vatican archives stand as a monumental exception to this rule, a deliberate, sustained, and incredibly successful project of anti-forgetting. But in that very success, it has created a new kind of mystery, the mystery of the curated past. We are left wondering not just about what was lost, but about what was saved and then set apart. The archive challenges us with a paradox. It is a guarantor of memory, yet it is also the architect of a specific kind of historical silence. It holds the keys to doors we did not even know were closed. So, we return to the whisper we followed at the beginning, the whisper of the forbidden text. Perhaps, after all this, the whisper is not about a specific book. Perhaps the whisper is the sound of history itself, a vast, complex, multivocal story that has been by necessity and by design edited down into a coherent narrative. The vanished gospel, real or imagined, becomes a symbol for all the alternative paths not taken, the voices not amplified, the perspectives that did not win the day. Its power lies in its absence. Its absence creates a space for wonder. It allows us to imagine a Christianity that could have been slightly different, a spiritual sensibility that might have emphasized the inner light a little more, the institutional structure a little less. That imaginative space is itself a kind of spiritual territory. It reminds us that faith at its origin was a wildfire of experience and interpretation, not a neatly bound handbook. The locked door in the archive, therefore, is also a door in our minds. It is the door to what if, and that door can never be permanently sealed by any authority, because it exists in human curiosity. Therefore, let this not be the end of the story, but an invitation to a different kind of listening. Listen to the gaps in the historical record. Listen to the debates of scholars not as dry academic noise, but as the sound of that curiosity patiently working. Listen to the official silence of institutions not as a wall, but as a kind of language. A language that speaks of caution, of protection, of a burden of memory so heavy it must be managed with extreme care. The quest for the vanished gospel, or for any lost fragment of our collective past, is ultimately a quest for a more complete humanity. It is an acknowledgement that we are not fully ourselves if we do not know our whole story. The vaults may remain closed. The procedures may remain in place. The whispers may remain faint. But the question will endure. It will endure in the quiet rustle of a page turned in a reading room, in the focused gaze of a scholar comparing texts, in the heart of anyone who has ever felt that the past has not told him everything. For as long as that question endures, the gospel, or the idea of it, does not wait in vain. It waits for the day when our understanding, our empathy, and our courage finally match the magnitude of the silence we have inherited. And until that day, its story is not one of loss, but of patient, enduring potential. A story not yet finished, because we are not yet finished asking. And in that unanswered question, in that sustained curiosity, lies the truest spirit of any search for what is sacred. A quiet breath passes. Silence stretches for a while.